shout, avenge the Maine today. It's Dewey's fleet the foe will meet down at Manila Bay.
Just after midnight on May 1st, 1898, Commodore Dewey's flagship Olympia entered Manila Bay. Dewey's 9 ships, modernized to compete with the navies of Europe, had yet to be tested in battle.
Daylight came out behind Manila and revealed gray fortifications. The binoculars showed a cluster of black hulls. 16 Spanish ships were counted. A shell soared toward our line. The plunge of the projectile was followed by the roar of the gun.
Commodore Dewey's squadron made 5 devastating passes at the Spanish fleet. By noon, the Spanish had surrendered their naval base in Manila Bay. 10 Spanish ships were destroyed. 1 U.S. sailor was killed.
That American forces could win a great victory clear on the far side of the world rendered Dewey's victory in the Philippines more amazing and more noteworthy. And when the news got back to the U.S., Americans rejoiced as they hadn't since the Civil War.
Raise a cheer, all earth can hear.
Dewey was the most famous man in the United States.
Times 3 again.
Spanish-American War was not only the war that probably got the greatest coverage in the newspapers, but it was also the first filmed war. Every vaudeville theater tried to show what were called actualities of the war. Most of them were faked. Most of the first films of the war were shot on the roof of New York buildings with toy boats and bathtubs, blowing cigar smoke to simulate the smoke of battle.
Dewey, promoted to rear admiral, was ordered to wait in Manila Bay for the U.S. Army. To secure the aid of Filipino insurgents, Dewey sent a ship from his fleet to Hong Kong to pick up Emilio Aguinaldo, the exiled leader of the Philippine Revolution. Dewey welcomed Aguinaldo aboard his flagship in Manila Bay.
Dewey gave him the honors of a general of the revolution. They met in the battleship Olympia, and I think Aguinaldo had developed the idea that while the Filipinos would like to be independent, they needed the protection of the United States, because at that time you have the German interest in the area, French interests, also United Kingdom.
Later on, Aguinaldo wrote in his memoirs that Dewey made promises to support the revolution, but there was one thing wrong, and that was there was no written promise made. Aguinaldo wanted to get a promise, but Dewey said, "My word is stronger than the most strongly written statement there is."
I think if I were going to put myself in the shoes of Aguinaldo, being really naive, you know, he was just a simple general in the Philippines. So he took the word of these Americans as, you know, accepted it as true.
Aguinaldo returned to his family's mansion in Cavite, just southwest of Manila, to devise with his generals a strategy to defeat the Spanish.
Compatriots, divine providence is about to place independence within our reach. The Americans have extended their protecting mantle to our beloved country, now that they have severed relations with Spain, owing to the tyranny that nation is exercising in Cuba. The American fleet will prevent any reinforcements coming from Spain. There, where you see the American flag flying, assemble in numbers. They are our redeemers.
General William Shafter.
In a little rustic cottage in the far-off Philippines sits a little black-faced maiden all alone.
Spain's army in the Philippines was trapped in Intramuros, a walled city within Manila, built by Spanish conquerors 300 years earlier. Aguinaldo's insurgents had besieged the stronghold for nearly 2 months.
They had gotten Manila almost completely surrounded to the extent that the Spaniards were running low on water and food. And Aguinaldo at this point asked the Spanish commander to surrender Manila to his forces. But the Spaniards, with their sense of pride, refused to do that. They feared that the Filipinos would take vengeance on them, that the Filipinos would murder them and rape their women.
Aguinaldo hoped that Rear Admiral Dewey's fleet would bombard Intramuros and force the Spanish to surrender to the Filipinos. But Dewey had been waiting for U.S. land troops, who began arriving in July.
The Filipinos had been led to believe that the Americans were their redeemers, their liberators, and so for as long as Dewey's fleet was there, it was all right. But when the soldiers came in, then the Filipinos began to have their doubts and became suspicious about American motives. The American soldiers, on the other hand, arrived thinking that they were really going to educate these people, and a lot of them equated the Filipinos with blacks, Negroes, and they looked down on many of them.
The Filipinos were portrayed by the press in a very different way from, say, the way that the Cubans had been portrayed prior to the U.S. intervention. What was more common was to portray the Filipinos as children, so that Uncle Sam would have to come in and establish a kindergarten and would educate the Filipinos for self-government.
The Spanish proposed surrendering to the United States in a mock battle for Manila. Few soldiers would be harmed, and the Spanish would maintain their military honor. Filipinos would be kept out of Intramuros by the U.S. Army.
The Battle of Manila was another one of these things where the Spanish did not want to simply raise their hands in the air and come out surrendering. It was almost like the reenactments that you see today of Civil War battles. Everybody knew who was going to win.
The Spaniards raised the white flag, the Americans rushed into the city as planned, and the Filipinos were left holding an empty bag. Before they knew what had hit them, they were still surrounding Manila, but Manila had changed hands into the Americans.
On August 14th, in the Church of San Agustin, the Spanish handed over formal possession of Manila to the United States. And like General Garcia at Santiago, Aguinaldo and his insurgents were barred from entering the city. Filipino leaders retreated to a monastery north of Manila to organize a government independent of the United States.
The people struggle for their independence, absolutely convinced that the time has come when they can and should govern themselves. Emilio Aguinaldo.
Of men.
They don't think it's possible for a democracy to be an empire, that trying to rule an empire thousands of miles abroad, they're convinced will corrupt American democratic institutions. But they also can't imagine absorbing the peoples of the Philippines in any form into the American Republic.
Is the Republic to remain one homogeneous whole, one united people, or to become a scattered and disjointed aggregate of widely separated and alien races? Steel magnate Andrew Carnegie.
Part of the treaty terms with Spain included $20 million for the Philippines. Carnegie, apparently sincerely, offered to pull out his checkbook and write a check to the United States government for $20 million, and in return for which he wanted McKinley to give the Philippines their independence.
Carnegie and former President Cleveland petitioned the Senate to reject the treaty, still 2 votes shy of ratification. The final vote was scheduled for February 6, 1899. In Manila, U.S. and Filipino soldiers eyed each other suspiciously across a neutral divide. Just 2 days before the